Hi, everyone. If you cannot hear us for some reason, just let us know in the comments. So, I am going to do a little introduction here. Thank you for joining us at our first ever Super Heroines Con. I am Carolyn No, Executive Director of Super Heroines, etc., and my pronouns are she, her. If you're not familiar with Super Heroines, we are a nonprofit that fights for representation and inclusion in geek culture. You can find us at superheroines.etc.org, or you can join the Discord conversation. I'll also drop that in the comments. And you can engage with us on social media by using the hashtag SheCon2020. As we begin, I invite you to join in acknowledging the land that we occupy that sustains us. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Whitney's asking me if she needs to do the intro, so I'm hoping people can see us. Oh, I see that we're running. Okay, cool. Sorry, I was like, no, we're not running. So truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across barriers of heritage and difference. And we begin to uncover what has been buried by acknowledging that we are not the first stewards of the lands we call home. Because of this virtual environment, we're coming from all over the United States, which means that you could be just about anywhere on the traditional land of many different people. So we definitely encourage you to look at native-land.ca to learn more about where you live. And we'd like you also to take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. We believe that acknowledgement is just the beginning, so after this event, we do encourage you to learn more. Since you're on YouTube, your mics are muted automatically, but you can ask questions in the comments, and we will make sure that they are answered. So with that said, I will turn it over to Fox.
Hello, my friends and loves. I am Rockette Fox, and I am here today to take you through a little workshop I'm calling Empowering Your Story. So first and foremost, my pronouns are she and her. And for a little bit of background about me, for anyone who may not know me, I am an American storyteller, illustrator, designer, performer, streamer. Some of you may have caught me earlier this week. That was still this week, yes, on the intro to streaming, which I believe is still up in the Super Heroines YouTube below, over there, maybe over there. So check that out. But everything from this entire week for the very first Super Heroines Con has been amazing. So whenever you get the chance, cruise around, take a peek at the other panels, workshops, things like that. All the content has been super high quality. But a little bit more, getting back on track, I have been storytelling live, personal stories, things like that, for about, I'm gonna say 7 years or so. And I started off telling stories at different local events before actually starting to host events through Super Heroines, etc. And a little another side note, I actually used to be the president of the board as well. So fun Fox fact. And I hosted and emceed and put together She Stories located in the St. Louis chapter and ran that for about 3 years, during which we had, back in the days of being able to meet and gather in person, live storytelling event evenings once a month, where there would be a different topic every month and people would come and tell personal stories under such topics. And for a couple examples of topics we had in the past, there were things such as celebrating women in your life that had inspired you in some way. We had things such as forgiveness, times you have or have not, or have asked for and received or have not, things like that. Stories about interactions with strangers, stories about times things were lost in translation. So just a whole bunch of things like that. And since then, have actually moved on to various virtual platforms doing that as well. So that's a little bit about me. But moving on to the good stuff, I'm here today to take you through empowering your story. So that being said, before we really get into it, as Carolyn had said, if you have anything that you want to know, want to comment on, want to ask me or anything, please feel free to throw that into the chat. I can actually see it because I have the all-seeing eye of StreamYard. But I would love to see any questions that you may have, and I'm happy to answer anything. Storytelling is a huge, huge passion of mine. You may gather from my varied labeled introduction that I do a lot of different things, but the one thing I've found in my own life that I've tied all of these together is storytelling. Whether I'm creating art or doing performance or even streaming, storytelling is the thing that kind of binds these things together. And for a really, really long time, I started to get really keyed into the idea of how storytelling impacts all of us, right? From commercial and ads to the obvious things such as movies, film, comic books, actual regular books, fiction on all of those sorts of things. But stories really impact us and the ways that we see the world, the ways that we communicate and interact with the world, the ways that we interact and see ourselves too, right? They, especially as coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives, they impact how we see people of different backgrounds and different perspectives. Storytelling is one of the oldest ways that we've been entertaining ourselves and each other as human beings. From the first times that people were sitting around the campfire, just communicating in whatever way with each other. So yes, I see a question already. Oh, you know what? I was on the wrong chat box. Hello. I did not properly hello to you. But I see the question here. What challenges are unique to open mic storytelling in terms of length, structure, etc.? And that actually kind of leads into where I wanted to go with this first. So I'm going to go ahead and answer that first. And actually, real quick, slight footnote. I do have a free worksheet available to anyone who would like it, designed and put together by and the link is going to be thrown up in the chat as well. It's a PDF you can download. So feel free for that. So that will be a resource. If you would like it, feel free. So getting back to the question. So challenges that I think are unique to open mic storytelling. The first thing that I always hear when people ask me about it and getting involved with it is, so I'll start by saying this. Everyone, all of us, we all have meaningful, poignant, important, and valuable stories to share. Every single one of us. And what often I continually hear stops people from sharing stories is self-doubt, feeling like people don't know how to share a story live, right? Just not knowing, like, okay, kind of back in terms of the question, how long should it be? How should I put it together? But also feeling like someone may not have a story that's worth sharing, So getting to that, so answering specifically form of it, mostly when you're listening to something live, I would say structurally, you're going to want to keep it between 5 to 10 minutes. Anything longer than that, you're going to start to lose people. And I say that hesitantly because, I at least, I'll not say we, because that might not be all of us, but I at least have definitely watched some videos of, for example, a TED Talk or something, or a live told story that it can be 30 minutes and I am enraptured the entire time. But there are studies that have been done that shows that people around the 20-minute mark tend to really start to just go away. They just go away. And it's not worth really trying to battle that. And especially if you're doing like storytelling event, the thing to bear in mind is you are storytelling with other people. So taking up that amount of time is also not polite. You're dealing with other people as well. So that's something to bear in mind too. If you go shorter than 5 minutes, you're really not able to get into as much depth as you might want to. And surprisingly, more so than you think, telling a story does take some time. So you may think, this story will only take me 30 seconds to tell. That's probably not true. So structurally speaking, when you're putting your story together, so the things that I think are really important for the structure, things that I notice that tend to be common, I don't want to say mistakes necessarily, but common choices that are made that can have at times a negative impact on the story is not having enough focus. So the way that I like to personally build stories is you want to have something akin to a thesis, right? You have a point to the story you're trying to tell, whether or not it's perhaps the punchline you're getting to, such as one of the stories that I tell is a story about the one time I got a tick bite when I was in bed and my husband called 911. That is what the story is about. And then when I'm actually telling the story, I expound from there and kind of set up things that set the scene, that then kind of explain the setting. This is where I was. I was comfortable. It was nice. And then something happened that changed that. It was not nice. And then I was really upset. And then and then he came in and I was really upset. And then this, and it keeps building on top and it builds on top. And then he comes back in and he says, I called the police. And then I am suddenly just stone faced, so kind of building it up that way, but it's all around this one single sentenced topic, right? And if for anyone who's taking a look at the worksheet, that's kind of what I am working this idea of empowering your story around. And kind of jumping into the worksheet a little bit. So I set this up a little bit differently than a building the structure of your story, because I wanted to focus today a little more on empowering you in telling your story, empowering your story, right? Because your story matters, because your voice matters. Because storytelling not only allows us to share our perspectives with others who may need to hear our experiences, but it gives us the space to speak validation to ourselves. And what I mean by that is that when you speak or have the idea that, well, I don't have a story that anybody wants to hear, well, I don't have a story that is worth telling, what you're saying is that your experience doesn't matter. And that's not true. I'm telling you this right now. Your experience does matter. So wipe that off wipe that out of there. And Iffy, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed the worksheet. So first off, you do have a story that matters. But it's really important to acknowledge that, you know? And I think especially in the world that we live in, where we are inundated constantly by storytelling and by bigger stories that are showing us what stories are important and what stories aren't, or rather what voices are important and what aren't. And an example of how be impactful is I had done a panel on representation in media, and something I had said about whitewashing of Asian stories before was just, and for anyone who's not totally familiar, the idea of taking a story that's been told where there are Asian characters being told in the story, like something that is an anime that's being made into a live action movie, but then taking those characters and making them white actors, where in the anime they are Asian people ghost in the shell. But I think that was actually specifically the example that came up. But what I was saying about that was what that says to me personally, and what that I feel says on a larger scale as well, is, hey, your story is good enough to tell, but you guys aren't good enough to be the ones telling it. And that's pretty shitty. And this, when you're telling personal stories, it's smaller scale than that, right? But in that, it is much more, it's much more personal, obviously in terms of ourselves, but it's also more personal in terms of who's hearing it, who's taking it in, and how intimate that space is able to be. So one of the things I've found in live storytelling sessions, like the venue that we had was a coffee shop, and it's fairly small, right? So it was always a really nice kind of a little more of an intimate setting. And the really cool thing is that you would get this experience where the person telling their story is able to share things that are maybe a little bit more personal, but the people hearing are able to feel a little bit more intimately connected with the story that they're hearing. So kind of going into that idea and going back into actually building the story, the idea of having one thing that you're focusing on. And you don't always have to tell a story that's like, it was the first time I had this horrifically vulnerable thing happened to me, and that I discovered the meaning of my life, and it just tore me up inside. Your stories do not have to all be just like this whole thing, right? You can have important, profound stories that are light and fun. You can have things that have fun moments and that like come around with really difficult moments as well. You can have all of that, but you do want to have a bit of focus in there as well. Now, I will say one thing to bear in mind that is really important to being empowered when you tell your story. You always, 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 always want to tell a story that you are comfortable with. Okay. So if you have a story that feels raw, like let's say there's a story that, man, I had this horrific breakup that happened last week, and it just happened, and it's a great story, and it's just tearing me apart inside. That is not a story to share publicly in a public storytelling forum. it's really important, really, really important to share stories from a place of feeling at one with yourself and at peace with that story. And yes, and listen, Iffy, you would be surprised though. You would be surprised because epiphanies, even grand epiphanies, can come in very seemingly mundane packages, right? You know, sometimes it takes a, you know, you gotta shuffle through some things, you know. You might be surprised. But yeah, going back, like, you always want to make sure you are when you're telling your story, you're coming from a place of being at peace with the storytelling. Now, talking like from a personal standpoint, you went through, again, using that same example, because I know I've been there. I'm going to guess that a couple of us in this space together have been there. I have, exactly, a bit more distance from the moment. I have gone through a horrific break or two. It's important to talk about that, right? But you talk about that with someone that you trust, right? And that is something different than speaking it publicly from a storytelling standpoint. And now we have another question. Do you have trusted creators you test your stories with, and what's that process like? So it kind of depends. So if I was going to be telling a story, if I was going to be telling a story that was a little bit more of a vulnerable story, and I was going to be telling it in a space that was a new space for me, I would probably run that by, honestly, I would probably run that by my husband, or, you know, just because these are the people who are closest to me and the people that I trust, and also very creative, very writing savvy, and things like that. And also people who know me very well, people who aren't going to be shocked by anything I have to say. You know, so that tends to be where I will run those things by. Now, that being said, my storytelling process though, so a lot of my storytelling process actually will be built in kind of testing material out here and there and building it into a more finished form as I go into more formal storytelling settings. So what I mean by that is when I am, for example, if I'm spending time with friends when there were days when we could do that, or if I'm spending time with people virtually, or if I'm streaming and I'm chatting with, you know, my chat at that point, I might, and something has happened that I want to kind of, I don't want to say test out, but something happened that I think is funny particularly, or something happened that I think is really interesting, I might tell a short version of that, such as there was one example when I got a hold of a dead squirrel and I left it under my side porch and then it disappeared. And that was a story. And I ended up telling it in a way that was much more engaging than that. That is the shortened version. That is the thesis of that story. You know, but I told this story, and then I engaged with the chat in that circumstance. And then following that, were I to go back and retell that, then from that point, I would go back and clean it up a little bit, right? That would be kind of the second spoken draft, as it were. And then kind of maybe figure out, okay, when I tell it next time, I'm going to want to maybe give a little more history about XYZ beforehand, or I'm going to want to maybe introduce this element earlier or do something like that, and then try telling it again and just see how that pans out. And so it's almost like writing drafts, but spoken drafts, I guess, if that makes sense. A lot of people have a lot of different processes. So if this is something that works for you, cool. Normally, I would recommend starting with live storytelling in the format of writing it down. And that's how I had actually started as well. The first live stories I told, I actually wrote down and memorized as if they were monologues, essentially. And the more I did it, the more I started to kind of just go from the seat of my pants or skirt, as the case may be today. And then the more years that passed and the more I got comfortable with it, the more I started being able to kind of understand my own flow works and how my own storytelling process internally works, and being able to just kind of play with that in a more free-flowing format, I guess, if that makes sense. And also, yes, I've heard, I'm assuming that's Carolyn. I have heard a very hilarious high school breakup story in that capacity, which was wonderful. It was wonderfully told. So in the capacity of coming from a place of telling your stories in an empowered fashion, and I'm gonna jump back over to the worksheet on this one. One of the things that I think is really important for this, and it's the first kind of little self-assessment question I put on here. What is vulnerable for you in the story that you want to tell? And I think this is one of the things that I think becomes the hardest when we are telling personal stories. Vulnerableness, illity, that's hard. That's really hard. And one of the authors, researchers, people I think speaks really well on this is Brene Brown. So I would highly recommend checking out her books and researches and TED Talks and such. But vulnerability is hard, and I think we can mostly universally agree on that. But that's an inherent part of the storytelling process, and that's what a lot of us tend to really connect on over this. And even if it's kind of vulnerability to a lesser degree, and what I mean by that is when I was writing this worksheet, the story I had in my mind that I was thinking of was, again, this having an ambulance called on getting a tick bite story. And I thought, okay, what is vulnerable for me in the story? When I tell this story to a new audience, what feels vulnerable for me is I will sometimes think, okay, the thing that feels vulnerable to me is that people might think I'm stupid. People might think that, oh my God, what is the problem here? It's not that big of a deal. Like, why would that even happen? When I'm early on telling the story, I talk about how I freaked out because I had this tick on me and stuff like that, and just be like, oh, well, people are going to think I'm freaking out over nothing, or that I'm like a weenie or something like that. And that feels very vulnerable to me. Right? Because I don't like people thinking that about me. That feels uncomfortable. And I think it's important when you are going to tell a story live to engage with that. And that leads into the second question. Why is that vulnerable for you? And I think when we are going to be telling stories like this, engaging with, okay, this is the part that feels vulnerable to me. And why it feels vulnerable, I think it's important to engage with that so that you are aware of that, for one, going in, and also so that when you are telling this story, you can kind of connect to how other people might be engaging with the story that you are telling as well. Let me think of one of the other stories that I've told. Okay, so there is another story I've told before in a couple different formats, but one of the themes that we had before was mental health challenges, mental health diversity was the theme that night. And I've told a story about how I first got on, or the story leading up to first getting on the medications that I'm on now. Yeah, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications for the curious among us. But what is, and there's a few things within that that I think could be vulnerable, but the thing for me that's really vulnerable is a part of that story addresses that I had relapsed in self-harm. And that is a very vulnerable thing for me to share. Just because it is, that's a very personal thing for me. And I see that there's a question. I'll and it's important for me to acknowledge that for myself, so that when I'm up there sharing the story, that I am validating myself in that. So when I get to that moment of the story, I'm giving myself the care that I need in sharing that part of the story, but also that I'm acknowledging, aftercare as well. Because I'm in a place where I can share that, and it's, I have enough space from that. I've made peace with that and things like that. But if I need to, after telling the story, to be like, okay, let's sit with that. Let's have a moment. Let's take some care. So from a self perspective, giving one the care that one may need afterward, but then from an outer perspective, recognizing that, okay, so for me, this is the most vulnerable part. Likely that may be an aspect of this very vulnerable for some other people as well. So whether or not, and before the story, I had given a trigger warning, so whether or not before the story being like, hey, heads up, there's a couple topics going to be enclosed, and for the entire night, because this was the topic of the evening, there was that. But also acknowledging that other people may have, vulnerable things brought up for them within that story. So acknowledging both sides of that, I think, is very important, but also very powerful. So let me jump back to the question here. So how do you cultivate that objectivity when looking at a story you're telling? I think it can be difficult to see ourselves externally like that from different facets like that. So I think in a situation like that, writing it down does help when you're wanting to tell something objectively. But honestly, I think a lot of times when you're telling a personal story, I don't think you always have to be necessarily objective, right? An example of that would be, there's a story I've told a few times about an ex that I had that ghosted me in a pretty, I'm going to go ahead and say, horrific fashion. And every time I have told the story, I have very clearly and unadulteratedly been like, this guy is an asshole, and I would punch him in the face with 10 fists, and so that is clearly not coming from an objective place. And I say that because, I was having this conversation earlier today with my husband, who's in that direction, which is why I'm pointing over there. But I had this conversation earlier today because we were talking about people from the past and such. And I was like, I look back on the entire situation and I realized there were moments and events that happened in that relationship in which I was pretty shitty. It's not a totally just a one-way street. Like, some shitty things back there, but that being said, when I tell the story, I can add that in. And when I'm in, when I'm in the place to do that, I can add that in and things like that. But not every story that I've been like, Well, this is a story about how two people, both of which were to blame, had a falling out, and and it happened this way, this way. Like when I've told the story historically, it's been like, no, man, this is a story about this person done me wrong, and I do not feel good about that. And this is how that wrong was done, and boo, boo, I say. So in that capacity, and I don't use name. Don't listen. If you're telling personal stories, as a footnote, don't go out there calling people out. Don't listen. Don't do that. For this particular story, I don't use names. I don't use anything that's going to identify people or anything like that. But I don't, that all being said, I don't think it always necessarily has to be completely objective. Like if you get up there and you tell a story from your perspective, that is extremely valuable. What are we doing if not sharing experiences and perspectives that we've had? And I think that's valuable. I think one of the real huge values in shared storytelling spaces is that we can hear other perspectives that are different from our own, right? I can hear the perspective and life experiences of someone who is nothing like me. And I can hear how that person has had experiences that are very different, but I can also still connect with that. And I think that's very powerful. And so I think that's really important. Now, let's see. I was going to go somewhere else. It's gone now. It's gone. But yeah, going back, I think, speaking from your perspective, totally okay. And yeah, no, listen, you want to hear more about who can be held down to get punched in the face with 10 fists? Well, you come find me later. We'll talk about that. But yeah, speaking from that, and also the other thing too, that I have space from a particular event, because I can tell this story from a place where I'm kind of making fun of it in a little bit of a way. Like I'm still irritated about it, right? Like you can have a relationship where somebody did something really obnoxious and be like, ugh, gross, but it's not coming from a place that's going to hurt me, So you want to make sure that's, because you want to protect yourself and you want to protect your audience too. So that's an important thing as well. So moving on to the next part of the worksheet here, just as you want to look at things in the story that are vulnerable for you, I think it's also useful and helpful to look at things that are empowering for you as well. And to use the same story example as the tick story, when I look at that same story and I think, okay, so what about this story makes me feel like, what makes me feel strong about telling that story? And the way I phrase this in the worksheet is what makes you feel strong in the story, but really I want to expand that to what makes you feel strong either in the story itself or about telling the story, right? So what makes me feel strong about telling that story is that it's a funny story, and that tell that story, people laugh because it's funny, and it's a kind of thing to where I don't feel like it's not the kind of thing where people are laughing at me. It's a totally absurd situation, right? And it's a little bit, but the whole thing is so absurd. And that makes me feel empowered because I feel like I am able to make people happy. I feel like I am able to make people forget about other difficult things going on. I'm able to bring people a moment of joy, or something like that. And that makes me feel empowered because that makes me feel good. So that is what about telling that story makes me feel empowered. And so going on to the next part of that, why or how does that empower me? Why does telling a story that makes people laugh or makes people feel happy make me empowered? looking a little bit deeper into that. And that starts to go into a little more of a dig inside, right? And I know about myself enough as well. And for those who joined for the stream talk intro to streaming, might have heard me briefly speak on when I'm doing my own stream. My goal is to create a space where people can go and just have a nice, relaxing, an atmosphere where I'm trying to provide a space where people can feel like a little bit of an oasis, where they're being cared for, where it's a nice space. Because, the people who are regulars, people who are coming to me, we all know what's happening right now. We all know the state of the world and stuff like that. And I find it's really important to be able to catch a break in a while. And even for me, I get real wound up. I get real overwhelmed very easily, and being able to try and care for people in this way, it's very important to me. So linking that back to why does that feel empowering, telling a story like this, being able to impart that is very meaningful to me. It has a really profound impact on what I feel like my role in the world is. And I'm not saying everything has to be that, well, I've discovered something, this about myself, but I'm not saying it can't lead you in that direction either. I'm saying it's worth digging into that a little bit and seeing, okay, how does it make me feel strong? And you might find that is something that you see happening in other stories that you want to tell. And it might be worth seeing where those things repeat or how they change between the different stories that you want to tell. And again, seeing how that might impact your audience. If it's something where you're telling a story about, what made me feel strong in this story is I stood up for myself. It's worth thinking about, okay, how is that going to impact your audience? Well, I stood up for myself to an employer. Then how that is going to impact your audience, you may have some other people listening who are like, yeah, maybe I too could stand up to an employer, and thinking about how that makes you feel strong could impart upon other people or connect with other people, or just, you always want to consider, because live storytelling is a collaborative experience. If you are live storytelling, you're not really storytelling, you're just speaking to a room. It's a collaboration. So it's worth always thinking about how it's impacting the room. So there's all of that to be considered. And if exactly, bigger questions like, what am I putting out into the world? What do I want to put out into the world? And etc. And being deliberate about that. So just kind of taking it to the next level a little bit. And this idea of just kind of sneaking back down to the last parts of the worksheet here, who would your ideal audience be? Which, in a real universe, we don't always have control over that, but it's at least worth considering, and that helps because if you have a story that is going to be a story that's perhaps better shared for a women or women identifying only space, you'll want to hold on to that until you can get into that particular space, as opposed to just going to any open mic storytelling, right? You want to, with your stories, curate where you're sharing them. And that's in part, again, the idea of protecting yourself, but also audience as well. So that's a two-way kind of thing in that sense. But you want to think about these things as you are developing your personal story that you tell, your collection, if you start thinking about different stories that you can have for different scenarios, right? Like I did a storytelling for a Halloween themed thing, which, you know, shockingly not stories are, but that particular story I would not tell just anywhere during any time because it really wouldn't be appropriate. And also likely, you know, if I told that one at the library for a young child event, they would not like that. That would not be for them. So just kind of parsing out that sort of thing. And this last thing on here, what is one thing you would want people to walk away remembering? In a way, that kind of links back to the idea of the focus of your story, right? The story you want to tell in one sentence, like, yeah, that time this happened, da, da, da. But in a bigger sense, I go to a different story that I have told. Well, actually, no. I will go back to the one that I referenced about the that I told for the mental health diversity evening. The main thing from that I would want people to walk away with is that everybody, right, no matter who they are, you know, no matter what people look like, no matter how it seems, can and have dealt with stuff, and that's okay. I think is the biggest thing at the core of my underlying thing that I would want people to take away from that, right? Because I think it's very easy, you know, and I won't speak, this workshop is not particularly about that, but just kind of expounding on that just a hair. I think it's very easy to look at, you know, people that we only see on social media or whatever, you know, and be like, oh man, this looks like XYZ, my goodness, you know, whereas you're not really seeing the full picture, and kind of breaking down that idea and being like, no, like this is this, and for anyone else who is struggling, that's okay. That's okay. You know, and that's really the biggest thing. And I think that when you think about that with a story that you're going to tell, that really helps shape how to tell that story. All of the different aspects you're going to focus on, and what, you know, the language you're going to use, how you build that structure, the rising action, the climax, all of these different things. The thing that you want people to walk away with, that should really be the golden gem at the center, the gooey, tasty center, you know, and let that shape how you tell your story, and like where you put, you know, if you're gonna throw some levity in there here and there, like how you build that up. And then, you know, the tone of voice that you use, the way you interact, engaging with the audience, eye contact here, there, at which moments, and things like that. So that's really the other big thing to think about with that. So we are getting to where we have just about 10 minutes left. I wanted for this workshop really to make sure that I had time to take any questions as well, just because this is a much more focused, and I have tended to get a lot of questions on this sort of thing. So yes, please. Does anyone have any questions, just based on all of this, about empowering your story? And I do think that a lot of this mildly tweaked, but I think a lot of this can actually port into even self-talk, because these are stories too. And I speak this from a personal place, the stories that we tell ourselves in terms of something happening, and then how we translate that into what it is we're telling ourselves the meaning is behind that, or what that means to us, or how we transcribe that onto ourselves as well. We have control over how we imbue those stories and how we tell those stories to ourselves. So I think it's really important to take stock and be deliberate about how we do those things, because we have that power, and because these stories do matter and are very important, and the part of that as well, even when you're telling a story, even when you're telling a very specific story, a very, very specific story, there may be 99 people in a room that you're telling a story to that are just like, I don't know anything about this. This makes no sense to me. But there may be one person who really, 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 really needed to hear exactly what it is you had to say. And you never know what kind of a difference that could mean to that one person, right? So I think that's really important. So it's always really, 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 really important to be able to share these things and to believe in yourself and validate your own story as well. So what are some good follow-ups for my workshop sheet? And some good guidelines for concrete steps to build a story from there, perhaps for the less experienced. Well, I actually, if you want to check out, I actually have a storytelling endeavor, more workshop-based endeavor that I had started a bit ago, that I can post this worksheet, there it is, up, but it is thestorybee.me. And that is a site that I have that is oh my goodness, hang on. All right, that is storytelling focused workshops. And that would be a good place to go. There are also some good online resources as well. During the month of November is National Novel Writing Month. And so if you go to NaNoWriMo.org, I want to say, when usually year round they have different, and this is a pretty big organization. They normally year round have different like resources and groups and things that you can join up in that are grouped by locations and stuff like that. But then during the month of November, from the 1st to the 30th, 30 days has to remember, from the 1st to the 30th, there is a challenge, which you can, but you don't have to. It's very interesting, where the idea is to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days. That to an aside, there are some interesting and neat resources just at the website to check out as well. But the biggest thing I would say is just starting to journal, right? Starting to journal and write out experiences. And maybe writing out, like take a story and a personal story and write out how you would tell it. And you can either start by writing it out. Yeah. Okay. So some smaller or medium-sized steps. I would say start with writing out just a personal story, and this is not something that you would have to share necessarily. So that I think makes it a much smaller step. Um, but of just a personal experience um, that, and either start by writing it out. And when I say write it out, I mean like free write it. Okay, stream of consciousness that. Like just start by just free writing it out. Okay, like because I think it's very easy for us to want to start out by being like, all right, we're starting it out in the perfect structure. This is going to be the finished version as I get going. No. Just start by writing it out, or alternatively, take a recording thing. We got recorders on our phones, some of us, or a computer or something like that, and start just by speaking this story out as if you were telling it to a friend. Okay, like, so one time I lost my boot when the you know, and just go from there and just say it, you know, as if you were talking to a friend. And whichever path you decide to take on this, just stream of I'm telling you, just stream of consciousness it. And then when you get done the first time, give yourself a space. Don't immediately go back to it. Just let it sit for a minute. And then what you do, go back, do it again. And go back and do it again the second time. Write it down and just try and think of what you did before or what you said before, do it again. And go back and actually, and give some space afterward, give a little space. And then after that, go back and look at both things and see what the difference was between either see, read, or see, listen, see with your ears, the difference between how you told the story both times or how you wrote the story both times, and see if there's differences, you know, or go back and try and write it with a different focus, you know, but when, and then as you go back, try and think about different things. Think about, as this worksheet goes, what is it about the story that you would want people to walk away remembering? And then try it again with this, you know, with that being in mind. How would you change it, right? And yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic idea too. Finding a small group of people to share with, like the Writer's Salon. And I don't know, this is a question for Super Heroines. I don't know if that was anything that ended up going up onto the Discord or the channel, because I know it was actually a shared thing that went on event-wise. If anyone can check out what happened with the Writer's Salon who wasn't there. Yes, so if anybody wants to see what happened with the Writer's Salon that was part of Super Heroines Con, check it out. It is up on the YouTube. But even just doing something like that with people that you're close to, that you trust, you know, doing something like that. But just getting into the process of getting in there and writing these shorter personal events, I think is a really great way to go. Yes, and there is the link right there for anyone who wants to check it out. So even just to get a sense of the structure of that and how that was set up as well. But yeah, are there any other questions or anything like that as well? And yeah, and I would definitely say too, as far as as far as the NaNoWriMo thing, again, like not necessarily to get started on NaNoWriMo or anything, but even if you want to check out the site, just because there will at times be resources that have different writing prompts or things like that, because even sitting down at a blank page sometimes can be a little hard to get started on, okay, personal story. I've lived a life. I have experiences. Sometimes it's just a little bit helpful to get prompts from an outside location, which I think has been helpful with, you know, themes whenever I was doing the She Stories events and stuff as well. Having a theme for the different storytelling events does help to narrow down, like, okay, yeah, a story about a time when I forgave someone or didn't forgive someone. That at least helps to narrow things down and get the brain going. So.
Awesome. So if there are no other questions, we have come like right up to about 5 o'clock here. Fox, that was awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. So we do have our happy hour tonight. There's a couple vendors joining us at 8. Definitely recommend coming and hanging out. It should be good. I actually, as I was sitting here, some of my Spaha stuff arrived. So I've got my like votes for women
that is awesome
bag. And the thing that I'm actually super excited about, which I'm really excited about this, but this is a glow in the dark constellation skirt.
What?
And Rockette Fox also has her shop up on our vendor page with a discount. So definitely check that out too.
Discount.
And I did want to mention, Fox and I were talking before we got on about this RPG writers workshop I did online. It was only $30. I'm going to write a blog post about it, but they're going to run it again in November. So I'm wondering if there might be some other like writing type workshops that go on in November that maybe aren't just for role-playing games.
There's got to be, guaranteed.
Yeah, I found it so helpful to go through the prompts, and I'm going to add the link in the chat too, but it really did kind of guide you to think about the different pieces, and you have to fill in like the meaty part, but they give you like the bones and maybe a little bit of the muscle.
That's so cool. I might be jumping onto that too, like that. Like as we were talking, as Carol and I were talking, and hearing the amazing idea that was coming, I was like, oh my god, I am so excited about this. So.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it helps you come up with your NPCs, your main storyline, and it was just super fun. And you get into this like group of other people who are doing the same thing, and I think that's also really motivating, having that like cheerleading group who's also kind of in the mud with you.
Well, and the thing too is like it's so much harder to do literally anything when you are on your own. Mm-hmm. Like especially creative. It's just hard. It's just hard.
Yeah. So if I get a discount code for that, I will be sharing that around too.
Yes, do it.
But thank you again so much. And if you do have questions, just you can find us in the Discord, and basically on all the social media. So, all right.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the of Super Heroines Con. It is amazing.
All right. Bye, everyone.